Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's instalment of the Australian Water Reform Roadshow. My name is Mark Dougal. I am the founder and managing director of Spiker. It's a couple of housekeeping rules. Today's session is being recorded, and that recording and today's slide pack will be made available after the seminar or the webinar. Please note we have just set up a YouTube channel. And an email will go out to you in the next day or so with a link to that YouTube channel that has all the webinar recordings on it. Please post your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. And when you're doing so, select all panelists so everyone can see your question. We'll be providing written responses also to any unanswered questions. We're happy for any participants to contact us and reach out directly for clarification, any further information on the topics we have covered today. Please provide us with your feedback and suggestions for other topics you would like covered in future webinar sessions. Thank you. Today we are privileged to have three very experienced water and local government executives talking to us about governance. First, we have Paul West. Paul is a former GM, which is equivalent to a New Zealand CEO of Devonport, Kingsborough, Waratah Wynyard Councils. They were in Tasmania. He was on the board. He was on the board and executive committee of the Local Government Professionals and also Local Government Managers Association, a national Australian body. He's also president of LGMA. He's a former member of the Local Government Board of Tasmania and today consults the local government on a range of issues. Michael Watson is an experienced board and governance advisor. He's a former chief financial officer, and company secretary of Barwon Water, and advises a number of government-owned organisations on governance, boards, and strategic direction. Russell Cooper is the founding managing director of Southeast Water here in Melbourne, and also was managing director of Goulburn Murray, an irrigation water business in central Victoria. He was also managing director of Suez Degramont for Australia and New Zealand, so has got experience in New Zealand, and is also was also a member of the Ministerial Advisory Panel on Water. Each of our panel today has over 30 years of experience in a range of local government and water sector areas, including governance and boards. Thank you. I will now The rules of engagement just for today is, firstly, today's topic is about governance, boards, ownership, and the legislation, and we are talking about that within the context of the Australian environment. However, we're also cognizant of the New Zealand reforms and where you're at the moment, and so we will also be obviously talking within that context today. As I said, these are about the Australian reforms and the Australian structures, and the idea is to draw comparison to the current reforms in New Zealand. We'll endeavour to provide you an unbiased view of what the situation in Victoria and Tasmania, and not necessarily what should be happening in New Zealand, but obviously lessons learned are really important. Please align any questions to the module topic, which is again governance, boards, ownership, legislation, and we can also throw in the regulatory environment in there. And we ask that you don't ask any questions directed at DIA because they are not here today. I will now hand over to our first speaker, who is Michael Watson. Michael.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning and for the opportunity to present to you. I'm just going to go through a few of the basics about the role of a board, but particularly I've focused this very much on the role of the board in any government entity at any level. So as it says there, a board member needs to ensure the functions are filled effectively consistent with its governance framework. So that's words used a lot, governance framework. The framework is simply the structure for the board on how it operates, right? What its duties are, and what its responsibilities are, both as a collective and as individuals. So with that, there's a required standard that all directors of any board or councillors must meet in their day-to-day functions. So what does that mean in a day-to-day sense? It means that you need to be focused on strategic and business planning for the organisation, performance monitoring, reporting role, risk management, which is a key board responsibility, And of course, the general stewardship role of ensuring the organisation acts in a financially prudent manner. So when you wrap all these things up, we use that term, a governance framework, but that's effectively what we're talking about in that space. This slide here is really interesting. Why is it? Because this is the ASX in Australia, the Securities Commission. This is their corporate governance principles. I'm just going to take a minute to take these through because these seem very obvious to people, but these are the backbone of any board having good governance. So first of all, lay the solid foundations for management and oversight. You must ensure that the role of the board and the role of management are clearly defined. Without that, there will always be inconsistencies on how people act and how boards operate. But it's also key that the board review the performance of management and held them accountable to that. Number two there is structure the board to be effective and add value. That is, have the right people on the board, the right size, the right skills. Skill-based boards are exceptionally important in government entities, and ensure that they can discharge their responsibilities effectively without any conflicts of interest, and they can add value to the board. Number three is about culture. Now, everything's about culture these days on boards. If you don't have the right culture, and if the board can't permeate that culture across the organisation, you will find there'll be acts that are either unlawful or unethical, and you won't act responsibly. Culture is the number one thing that a board at any level of business or government must ensure that they have in place. Safeguarded integrity of corporate reports. That's where we talk about our auditors and all the fun they give us. But it's very important that a board has a sense that it's corporate reporting at all levels, not just financial, performance management, the performance of the system, the physical system that they're running, their services they're providing. Then we've got to ensure the reports that they're receiving from management are accurate and timely. Make timely and balanced disclosures. Now, I'm a big fan, particularly in government businesses at all levels, of transparency. So you must make timely and balanced disclosures. Now, in the Victorian water case, which I'm well versed in, for instance, within 5 days of any board meeting, the minutes of that meeting are required to be published on the internet for all public to see, including all the decisions. So there's a level of transparency there that allows you to move forward. Respect the rights of security holders. Now, this may not sound applicable to some people in today's audience, but it actually is. I was Chief Financial Officer of a water corporation that has currently $600 million of 10-year floating debt. So it's vitally important that that is managed appropriately and that the security holders of that debt are accurately informed at the state of the business. Recognise and manage risk. Risk management is just a key governance principle now. And it's not just about risk management, it's also about opportunity. A board's requirement is to ensure that they manage the opportunities that are there for them as well, not just ensure they've got mitigation for risks that may happen. So we use terms like innovation and et cetera to talk about, but really it's about opportunity risk. And the last one is remunerate fairly and responsibly. Any entity needs to ensure they have a proper remuneration structure for all employees, all management and board members to ensure that they're remunerated appropriately and that they can move forward understanding the value that they're contributing to the business. Thanks, Craig. This is a real simple model, but this is pretty much how the Victorian model has worked since we sorted out our various mergers and consolidations. So up on the top right-hand corner there, we've got legislation creating a statutory body. Now, you know, that's an act of Parliament, and Russell will go into that a little bit later, a bit more. But then you have your enabling legislation, your legislation that tells you what your functions are, what your responsibilities are, and you can build your governance framework around that because that's what they're responsible for. Later on, I'll talk a bit about how that is actually done in practice in the Victorian model. The board of directors. So you've got your board of directors, and that comes through your enabling legislation, just like your functions and your responsibilities. So then you have specific legislation relating to a statutory business, a government business. And in the Victorian case of water, there's two main acts, the Water Act and the Water Industry Act. And those two acts govern very much the functions and responsibilities of the directors of that business. Then you have your general business legislation, which can be everything from occupational health and safety and all the normal health requirements that you have. There's a whole raft of them. The Environmental Protection Act in Victoria, there's a whole raft of them. But then on the right-hand side there, we've got regulation and compliance, because on top of the business legislation, you have a number of regulators when you're a government business who have the right and can demand a lot of regulation and compliance information to them, including health, environment, pricing is a huge one. The economic regulator in Victoria requires a lot of information from the water businesses on an ongoing basis. So that pull all that together, regulation and compliance becomes a key cornerstone of the board. Now, most boards delegate a lot of that through to their risk and audit committees, but at the same time, you can delegate, but you can't abdicate. You've got to be responsible for the outcomes of those compliance mechanisms you have in place. Out on the right-hand side, I've just given a very, very short example of how board appointments happen in the Victorian example. The public advertisements go out about 6 months before the appointments are to be made. Over that time, and those public advertisements direct you to a website. It's a general website on the government's webpage. You then fill in the information showing your skills and why you want to join the board against a selection criteria that's put up there. And then there's interviews held by an independent panel appointed by the department and the minister. Then there's a list of provided to the minister, which is then taken to a meeting of cabinet, of state cabinet, where they have a review of that. And ultimately, the owners of the business are the state government, and they make the decision and they make the appointments. And then that all flows back through. So it's a long process, but it really allows the government to match the boards with the skill set they need. And there's no requirement that you have to be within a geographical area or that you have to have a certain skill. There's certainly a strong push by the government to ensure the right level of diversity are on the board to improve performance of the boards and the right gender balances. And that's all been put in place in the last few years and is working very well. And the performance of the board seems to be exponentially increasing over time. So that's really how the Victorian model, the governance model, works.
Now we'll hand over to Russell, I think. No, sorry, Paul. Paul, you're next.
Yep. Yes, good morning and thank you, Mark. And it's great to be here to just go through with you this morning some of the setup around the Tasmanian government's model in relation to TasWater. The TasWater voluntarily adopted the ASX's corporate governance principles and recommendations as the framework and the basis for which they will manage their corporate governance in the company. It's not a publicly listed company, so not all of those principles are actually relevant. And in some areas, TasWater's governing legislation under the Sewerage and Water Act requires a different context and structure that actually precludes them from actually complying with some of those principles. Where that's occurred, what TasWater has done has sought to use those principles in its policies and practices. So it still can remain compliant with the legislation, but at the same time, it's using the best practice corporate governance principles within its business framework. TasWater is owned by 29 local councils, so the model in Tasmania is different to Victoria. So it is owned by the 29 councils, and the state government in recent times, in the last couple of years, actually bought a 10% stake in TasWater. Their 10% stake is being paid to the TasWater over a 10-year period at $20 million a year. So it's a $200 million stake for their their 10% share. The councils have varying levels of equity, and that equity is actually based on the value of the assets minus the liabilities when they actually transferred the assets and liabilities from the councils into what was originally 3 regional corporations, which was then created into one organisation, being Taswater. So just to give you a bit of an understanding of what that might look like, the smallest council stake in Taswater is Flinders Island, which is in the northeast of the state in Bass Strait. They have a 0.18% share of Taswater, whereas the largest is Launceston, which is the largest council area in the state with a population of about 70,000 people. They have a 13.62% share in Taswater. And then all the other councils have varying amounts between those two figures. The 29 councils each have 1 representative which they appoint to the owners' representatives group. And the owner representative group is to provide the oversight from the owner's perspective to allow there to be some direction provided to Taswater from the owners as to what they expect the organisation will provide. The councils receive a dividend every year from Taswater. There's a cap on those dividends. Presently, the dividend is $20 million a year. It originally was planned when it was first created, there'd be $30 million of dividends, but that was reduced in agreement with councils a few years back. In the recent times, because of COVID, of course, there was a year when no dividends were paid. And so the agreement with Taswater is that over the next 5 years, they'll pay an additional $4 million a year to the owner councils as part of a dividend process. So going back to those examples I gave before about the size of the councils, so of the $20 million, Launceston would receive around about $2.7 million of dividends each year from Taswater, whereas Flinders Island, with a 0.18% share, would receive about $36,000 in dividends. The board is an independent board that's appointed to provide the direction for Taswater, and the selection process is that the owner reps group, they appoint a board selection committee in accordance with the Constitution, and the people who are on that board include the chief owner representative. So of the 29 council owners, they elect a person from that group to be the chief owner's rep, and that person is really the main conduit between the board chairman and the owners, and would also attend government business oversight committee meetings and attend those type of things on behalf of the owners. The 4 members of the owners of the board selection committee includes members from each of the regions. So each region has some involvement in the process, and that's 1 from the northwest, 1 from the north, and 2 from the south. And that's pretty much broke down on the fact that about 50% of the population of Tasmania, which is around 530,000 people, 50% of the population live in the south of the state, and there's about 25% in the north and 25% in the northwest. The board chair is also part of the board selection process for all the positions, obviously apart from the chair. And there is a state government representative as part of their 10% stake in Taswater. The state government does not receive any dividends, but part of their agreement with them was that they would have a representative appointed to the board selection committee, and that allows the state government to have some involvement and some ability to influence the makeup of the board. The board's independent, as I said, they're skills-based. They have a maximum of 7 people who are independent directors. Currently, there are 7 directors, and they are actually on the board for a varying period so that there is that continuity of the board. So each year, there's directors that their positions become vacant, or they are able to be reappointed for a maximum of 2 terms. The process of recruiting them is undertaken through that board selection process. Usually they're advertised. There is succession planning that they use in the board process. They've also got the ability to have committees under the board structure as well. And there's a disclosure of interests that has to occur as part of that process as well. Any person who is currently an elected government official at any time within 3 years preceding their intended date of appointment are ineligible to be appointed to the board. So if you've been an elected government official for a period of 3 years, you cannot apply to become a member of the board. And any person who is currently an elected government official, so that would be the councillor, any councillor or anybody who is involved with government at all, or is currently employed within councils or with the Crown, are ineligible also to be a member of the board. Next slide, please, Craig. So this model, this process here is just a model of how the structure works in Tasmania. So at the top there, you've got the owners, the 29 councils and the Crown. They appoint the owners' representative group. There's a shareholders letter of expectation, which basically provides that direction from the owners to Taswater as to what the owners expect. Now, the state government has the ability to review and have input into the shareholders' letters of expectations as well. The owners' representative group, as I mentioned before, appoint the board, and then the board is responsible then to go through this process of providing the direction for the company, but also to make sure that the operations of Taswater comply with the Constitution and also the Water and Sewerage Act. The corporate plan process is that the board will present the corporate plan to the owner representatives. The owner representatives do have the ability to reject the corporate plan or to request amendments to the corporate plan, but there's a process that's been set up under the Constitution that makes sure that it can't just reject it and not have some basis for that, but also there are some mechanisms where there is a process for a review, and for it to go back through a process, it can't just be rejected out of hand. The owner representatives do have the ability to, at any stage, if they wish, to replace board members. That hasn't happened. I can say that in the Taswater experience, it's been the owner representative been very comfortable and happy with the actual board members that they've had in place since Taswater was implemented back in 2012. So there's a lot of other reporting that requires from Taswater's perspective. You've got the financial reports, a quarterly performance report. There's a quarterly performance report that's provided to the owners' reps quarterly, which is, there's an expectation that the chairman of the board and the CEO will actually attend quarterly performance meetings with the owner representatives, the annual financial report, and then there's a number of regulators that are involved in the process in Tasmania as well. You've got the economic regulator, the EPA, public health, TasFire, WorkSafe Tas. There's all of those that are involved in making sure that the company complies with the various pieces of legislation that's involved with Taswater. And then you've got the state parliament, and the Minister for Finance and the Minister for Water have also got a role to play in all of the regulation and the processes that are in place for Taswater. And I think I now hand over to Russell.
Well, thank you for that, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. So coming back to the Victorian water industry, the enabling legislation is shown at the top of the slide there, the Water Act of '89 and the Water Industry Act of 1994. Both those are quite old, and they've become very convoluted and a little bit confusing over the years as various amendments have gone through. They're trying to cover, of course, the situation in large metropolitan urban areas, small regional areas. They're covering also rural irrigation businesses. And it's really a bit of a minefield for lawyers to become bogged down in. There was a plan in 2014 to actually update both of those acts into a new combined act. And I was part of an advisory body under the Water Minister, Peter Walsh, at the time. And a group of us spent probably about a year and a half going through all of the wrinkles in the old acts and pulling together what was going to be a new act for 2016. All the work had been done, all of the consultation work had been done, huge amount of consultation with different groups, including Indigenous groups, community groups. And in 2016, we were ready to push the button, and there were about 30 items of legislation go through, and there was a change of government because of the election. So all that work is sitting in a couple of bookshelves somewhere, ready to go again. It wasn't the highest priority for the incoming government, so it's a work in progress for another day. So we're still left with the two acts going back to 1989, 30-year-old acts. Below that, there's the Department of Water and DELP, or Department of Environment, Land, Water Planning, which really control a lot of the aspects relating to appointing board members. We've heard about that before. They overlook the high-level policy directions from the government. They're the people who review the strategic plans that come in from the various water authorities across the state. All of the water authorities in Victoria are publicly owned. There was a move back in 1995 to privatise those water companies in Melbourne, the three retail water companies, one of which I was running. But that didn't happen. The incoming Kennett government at that time had decided to try and restore the economic situation for the state, so they decided to sell their electricity assets, their gas assets, and they were to follow that up with water. But they made so much money from the sale of gas and electricity that their need for money from water was much reduced. And they were also picking up a pretty strong message from the general public about water was something that should stay in public hands and should not be privatised. So because there was a lack of need and a strong message from the community, that's the way it's been. The other side of government or parliament said the same thing. So we've basically got both sides saying no, water companies should stay in public hands in Victoria. And notwithstanding that, many of those companies enter into boot schemes from time to time. Boot scheme is a build, own, operate, transfer scheme, and they use external contractors, sometimes from overseas, one of which I used to run, called Suez, Degremont. And effectively, it's a little bit of privatisation on the fringe, if you like, of those publicly owned water companies, because the private contractors would come in and, as I say, design and build a plant, own it and operate it for maybe 20, 25 years, and then transfer it to the water company. There's an example of that in Bendigo, where Veolia, the other French water company, built a water filtration plant, and they're still operating that, I believe, for Colburn Water, which runs the water supply around Bendigo. So the boards and chairpersons, moving down the slide there, responsible to the minister. The chair has that primary role, carrying the messages to and from the board. Of course, the board, and in particular the chairperson, appoints the managing director of the water authority, and it's then up to the managing director with his or her executives and staff to actually run the business in the day-to-day manner, as is consistent with government policy objectives and the strategic plan. On the right-hand side there, you can see the three regulators listed: the Essential Services Commission for Pricing, the EPA for environmental issues, and Department of Health for water quality issues. So I'll go to the next slide, please. Again, a slightly different view on the same style there. We've got the state parliament above the various government departments, water resource management, water entitlement, financial monitoring, treasury department in there. Many of the ministers get involved in the final selection for boards of water authorities. It's under the control of the Minister for or DELP, as we call it, Environment, Land, Water Planning. But they then submit the proposals to the Cabinet of State Government for a tick, so that people who are being appointed to boards meet the requirements of many of the ministers that run the state parliament.
So, Russell, just so I can clarify, in Victoria, unlike in Tasmania, the minister makes the final call, or the cabinet makes the final call.
Well, really, the cabinet makes the final call on the recommendation from the minister. Most of them, I guess, will be a tick and run through, but there's the opportunity for the cabinet to reject some of the proposals. So then moving down to the service delivery entities, we've got on the left-hand side there the catchment management authorities. Now they're very active in the regional area of Victoria, where they're responsible for the streams and the rivers. Many of the rivers are delivering water for potable use further down the stream and also for irrigation purposes. So if I give an example there, Lake Eildon, which is a major catchment in the centre of Victoria, sends water down the Goulburn River. The Goulburn Broken Catchment Management Authority, based in Shepparton, is responsible for the stream flows, and in particular making sure that the riverbanks aren't unnecessarily eroded or other problems occur. And that Goulburn River runs through Shepparton, where water is extracted from the Goulburn River and treated to be supplied to the residents of Shepparton and the surrounding areas. As it goes further down the river, the water is extracted in various places to run through irrigation channels. There's some 6,000 kilometres of irrigation channels across northern Victoria, delivering water to people who are running dairy farms, people running orchards, running other crops, etc. And moving to the right there, the Rural Water Corporation. This major one is Goulburn Murray Water, which is based in Victoria, just near Shepparton. And that's looking after those 6,000 kilometres of irrigation channels and also maintaining the integrity of the major water storages like Eildon, like Hume, like Dartmouth, Epplock, Eildon, and so forth. And all of these water storages need to be monitored carefully to make sure that they do their job in terms of capturing rainfall and preventing flooding, but also holding back water for use in terms of drier times of the year for either irrigation or drinking purposes. And across to the right there, the urban water corporations in the cities and towns across the state, and of course also in metropolitan Melbourne, where there are three very large retail water companies: South East Water, Yarra Valley Water, and City West, or Greater Western Water as it's now called. And to the right, as I mentioned before, the three regulators, the Essential Services Commission. So this is where submissions are made each year or so from the authorities to say this is the level of expenditure proposed in terms of renewed capital. And because of this, we need to change the prices by this amount. The Essential Services Commission reviews the proposed capital expenditure plans and looks at the request for price increases. So this is the prices charged by the authority to the individual customers. And basically they give a tick. They go through a consultation process, quite detailed, with the community and community groups. Below that, the EPA is involved with discharges from treated wastewater plants. They're very keen for the minimum amount to go back into streams, even if it's very, very pure. In fact, they'd much rather see reuse schemes being operated with the product coming from treated wastewater plants as opposed to going into streams, which is a last course possibility. Then there's the Department of Health and Human Services, who look over the Australian drinking water guidelines to make sure that the water being supplied is as good as possible and meeting the requirements. So there's a very strong connection between the EPA and the Department of Health and Human Services, because if we have situations where treated wastewater plants aren't operating properly and water's being discharged to places where it might be sourced into the potable system, then all sorts of problems, of course, can occur. So there's a very close link there. On the bottom of that slide, of course, is the bar relating to the water users, the customers, and the advisory groups. Lots of consultation down there to make sure that the authorities are supplying what the general population is looking for. And from time to time, something might go wrong with what the water customer is getting. And if they can't seek appropriate redress from the supplying authority, they can go to the bottom right-hand corner there to the Energy and Water Ombudsman and seek some rectification there. In the case of water in Victoria, if the customer chooses not to pay, the legislation requires that the water authority can only restrict the flow of water into the property. They can't cut it off. Whereas with gas and electricity, and now especially in private sector hands, if you don't pay your electricity bill or your gas bill, the supply will be cut off. The idea of limiting the supply of water as part of an encouragement for someone to pay their bill is about being able to still fill the toilet systems and operate the sewage system, but to inconvenience the customer insofar as showers wouldn't operate and bigger volumes of water are not available. And it usually works fairly well to cause the payment to be made. So go to the next slide, please. And so the corporations are owned by the government, as I've said before. There are a number of boot schemes, which I've mentioned, build, own, operate, transfer schemes. Not dissimilar to some of the ones that operate in New Zealand. I was involved with one at Wellington, Lower Hutt Council at the time. So these boot schemes are a good way of drawing on other resources from other parts of the world. So the chair and the board of directors' responsibilities, I think we've covered a fair bit of that already, but basically the making sure the legislation is being followed correctly. The authority needs to put together a strategic plan or business plan every year, submit that to the shareholder for approval. Of course, the people involved in the business and the culture of the business is something which is becoming increasingly important, and the levels for those things are very much set by the board of the authority and the managing director and his or her executive team to follow through and basically deliver that. Corporate governance, making sure that all of the boxes are ticked in the appropriate manner, is part of the important role of the chair and the board of directors. And of course, financial management, making sure the business plan is being followed and that the expected levels of profit are being generated to produce the dividends that the shareholder is expecting to receive. And throughout the process, risk management and looking after the health and welfare of employees through the management of lost time injury policies and what have you are a key part of the board as well. So the MD has the responsibility for the day-to-day operation and management of the business and for ensuring things like capital works programs are running on time, on budget, and providing the leadership to the staff by communicating what the priorities are for the business at any one time. And of course, the MD is responsible for gathering together the reports, submissions, and other information to be presented to the monthly board meetings for the board to either note or to approve, depending on what the nature might be. So I think I'll leave it there and pass it back to Mark at this stage. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. We've got a number of questions. I'm going to ask the first question. Not the first question I want to ask is continues from what you were talking about, Russell. It's not necessarily in the sequence they've come in, but I will come back to the earlier question pace, earlier questions posted. The question, Russell, is many in New Zealand will get the shivers. Now, this comes from Leslie Smith, sorry. Many in New Zealand will get the shivers hearing Russell talking about the state's interest in privatising water assets in the 90s. Do you have any reflections on how the setup of entities can be structured to protect them from privatisation in the future? Before you answer, just correct me if I'm wrong, Russell, and the other panelists, but there are no privately owned water entities in Australia. They're all government owned, correct?
No, that's not true.
Oh, okay.
That's not true. Murrumbidgee Irrigation in central New South Wales is privately owned. It used to be publicly owned. It's privately owned.
Okay.
It's a rural water business. I think there might be a few other little ones around the country, but in general terms, what you say is correct, Mark. Yes.
All the big ones are
Yes.
publicly owned, whether it be state government
Yes.
or local government.
Correct.
So back to the question. Do you have any reflections on how the setup of entities can be structured to protect them from privatization in the future?
Well, I think it's a legislation situation that controls it. I mean, the government of the day, the state government of the day, could choose to pass some legislation and privatise whatever they want. They were certainly going down that path when the old Melbourne Water was disaggregated to form 3 retailers and a new wholesale, which was called Melbourne Water. They were planning to sell the 4 businesses, certainly the 3 retails. I'm not sure about the 4th one. Certainly the 3 retail businesses were planned to be sold. So they were set up at that time. This is 1995, with a board of directors who were not only skill-based, but actually came from fairly high-level roles in the private sector. For example, the initial chairman of Southeast Water was a guy called Rick Charlton, who was the former CEO and chairman of Shell Australia. He'd been a Shell executive all his life. He'd been a high-profile businessman. There are a number of very much high-profile fellows, people on that initial board. They were set up to be able to pass across to a new private sector owner and to bring into play some private sector principles. In amongst all that, the government of the day decided to use the term corporatisation. So the term was that Southeast Water and Yarra Valley Water, City West Water, were corporatised. Probably not the best word to use, because a lot of members of the public thought corporatised meant privatised. So whenever there was someone wishing to throw a bit of criticism at us, it was, because you guys have now become privatised, we can't do this, or we'd like you to do that. It was a difficult thing. But corporatisation at that time meant that the selected board of directors were to operate in corporate style, with corporate style principles, a bit like the ASX principles that Michael and Paul were referring to before, and to do such in a way that it was being treated as if it was a private company, although it was still publicly owned. To answer your question specifically, Mark, I think it's a question of what's in the legislation, or what legislation might be passed that would control which way it goes. It's in the hands of the shareholder, the government, to do what they wish in that regard. But in the state of Victoria, both sides of government, well, Parliament, have said, no, we don't want to privatise water. There's no appetite to do so. There's no driving position. So unless something drastically changed, I can't see it happening. But by having said that, the boot schemes, I've mentioned a couple of times, the build, own, operate, transfer, is a way of a little bit of privatisation on the fringes to bring in the skills that maybe the authority doesn't necessarily have in-house at that point in time. And that's applied in New Zealand as well as Australia.
And that also brings in capital to build things. That doesn't appear in the Michael.
Also, it's not a specific protection, but in the Victorian model, all monies from the water corporations that they borrow for their capital works, their whole balance sheet, there is only the state government is the only security holder. All money is borrowed through state governments. So they have set up Treasury Corporation of Victoria, which provides a great funding source for all the Victorian companies. So on their balance sheets, there's currently no one owing, there's no money owed to any domestic or international banks. It's purely, or any other funding source. So even superannuation funds can't get into the mix. It's all through a state government agency.
They don't have the risk of an administrator coming in on a loan default or anything like
Correct.
that, basically.
Correct. The government actually guarantees all water corporations in Victoria, they are lender of last resort. That's in legislation.
Okay, great, thanks. And Paul, and I suppose in Tasmania, the protection is really the shareholders in the constitution of the company.
It's that, and it's also the Water and Sewerage Act as well. So it's an act of Parliament that's created Taswater, and so there is the protection through that process as well. So I can't say that in Tasmania's example that it's likely that it would ever be privatised.
Okay, thanks. So I think there's a fairly strong level of protection there that gives us comfort that at least in the examples we've talked about, the risk of privatization is extremely low, if almost negligible. A follow-up question from Leslie Smith again. What drivers does your EPA or other regulators have to encourage the uptake of alternative water or water efficiencies? In the absence of an allocation regime that puts, so this is questions asked in the absence, in the context of the absence of allocation regime that puts a price on water consumed by the utilities, I'm interested in other ways our sector could be structured to improve water efficiency.
Well, maybe if I could begin with that answer, Mark. I don't think it's really the domain of the EPA in Victoria to drive that sort of approach. The EPA as a regulator is really about controlling the level of pollution that may occur. In the case of water authorities, it's primarily about spills from the wastewater collection systems and spills from the wastewater treatment plants. But there are other things that might be done along the way, where maybe a water authority might store some inappropriate material somewhere and cause the wrath of the EPA to come down. I was on an EPA advisory board for enforceable undertakings, and the EPA takes the view that whilst they can fine people who cause pollution, including water authorities, to put a fine through and to make it stick with the way lawyers can work in the courts, it's actually better to get the person or the organisation that's caused the problem to enter into what's called an enforceable undertaking, where they will do various things to ensure that A, it doesn't happen again, but B, to communicate to their peers, this is what we did, which was not too good. This is what we've done to make sure it doesn't happen, and this is what you should take as a learning from this. So I was on a panel that actually reviewed those things, and I reviewed a number of those that related to water authorities in Victoria, where the EPA could have chosen to take them down the pathway towards a big fine, a couple of $100,000 fine, but they chose to go this way because they thought it was a better outcome for the industry. So that's not a very good answer to the question posed, but I'd just say that in EPA doesn't really cover.
Sorry, Russell, if it's not the EPA, then who would regulate water efficiencies, water uptake, alternative water? Leslie, can you just confirm by alternative water, you mean recycled water? Yeah. I'll wait for Leslie to confirm that, but who regulates water efficiency?
Well, I think that would be more in the regime of DELP, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. So they would be looking for reuse schemes, encouraging reuse schemes, looking for directions in terms of a business plan from a water authority about this is what's proposed. This is very topical where new developments are coming in. There's a big move towards the third pipe sort of arrangement where treated wastewater is pumped back to domestic dwellings through a purple pipe to distinguish it from the normal incoming water pipe. Very easy to do at the time of a new development when all the trenches are open and the pipes can be easily laid there. Quite hard to do after the development has occurred and to go back and do it retrospectively. But that sort of thing would be encouraged very much by DELP, and they would be giving that encouragement either directly in terms of government policy suggests you should be going this way, or it might come indirectly in terms of, well, your business plan this year doesn't include a lot about water reuse. What are you going to do about it? We'd like to see more happening. Maybe Michael could add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Russell. Yes, what happens really is the whole process is predicated on the fact that we do have shortages of water at different times. So all the water corporations in Victoria are actively considering their water efficiency. They do report to DELP on a regular basis on that. They do have plans in place that they must submit to DELP for water efficiency. And in the world of efficiency with things like recycled water, the water corporations have all undertaken work with local councils to ensure that recycled water is effectively used wherever it can. So in the case of Barwon Water, which I'm well versed in, they have 16 gigalitres of recycled water being pumped out to sea every year. Now they have set themselves some very ambitious targets to do that, to fix that. The largest estate, new estate in Geelong area has 85,000 new connections they're planning on. So they're effectively planning on a size of Bendigo, a major city in Victoria. So every house has recycled water in there for toilets and for outdoor watering, and they're currently investigating using it for washing as well. So there's some significant work going on. I don't think it doesn't overly need to be regulated in Victoria, because there is a will and there's a way, and developers, councils, water corporations are all striving to do it. There's a lot of work being undertaken in Victoria with support from the state government, where they're providing grants to water corporations to do backfitting projects for water efficiencies for households and vulnerable customers. So vulnerable customers often have old pipes, leaky pipes. There is significant grants available to every water corporation that they all take up, and it's in literally the millions of dollars to help those people by backfitting and providing resources for them to be more water efficient. So there's a whole raft of programs happening, and when we talk further on, Mark, about the statement obligations, I can talk a bit more about that.
Sure. So just Leslie's confirmed, yep, she was talking about recycled water, but also stormwater harvesting and rainwater usage, rainwater tanks, etc.
Yeah, and I think that final point that Russell made was really, really relevant. Outside my window here, there's a massive retaining basin from the area I live in. It's a new development. Every new development that I've seen in the last 5 years in the region I live in, which is a large part of Victoria, every new development harvests its storm water, either for sporting ovals or for just greening the area, and only goes out to sea or into rivers if there's an overflow situation. But it's just stock standard planning practice in Victoria now for new developments to utilise and harvest stormwater for the beneficial use of the residents.
Thanks, Michael. Just for the audience too, the week after next, we'll be hearing from some of the current operators of water utilities, such as Southeast Water, where Russell was the founding MD, and we'll be hearing from one of their current executives who will be talking about a development here in Melbourne called Fisherman's Bend, and they're in. He will talk about a whole integrated new development that includes every drop of water being used multiple times in the area. So we'll be hearing more about that in a couple of weeks' time from somebody actually implementing a program like that. I'll put a question to you, please, Paul, which came in, one of the first questions that came in is, does the equity interest of each council change over time? That is it reflected in new urban development? So as an area grows, does it get a bigger equity in Taswater?
No,
or is it fixed forever?
It was fixed based on the initial input from the councils, and so the percentage doesn't change. It has changed once since the process started, and that was when the state government acquired a 10% shareholding. Each council lost a small percentage of their shareholding to allow that 10% to be given to the state government.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an interesting concept for future consideration, is if one part of Tasmania grows a lot more than another part of Tasmania, it may not be seen as equitable anymore. I think it's an interesting concept.
It is interesting.
Potential problem.
But I think originally the intention of the dividends was to ensure that the councils were still receiving a reasonable level of income based on what they were previously achieved through the water and sewage rates process. And so that was the original intention, and it is only a very small proportion of the overall money that Taswater is managing, and it's capped at the $20 million mark at this stage.
Thank you. Question from Gerard, and I suppose it's a Victoria versus Tasmania question a little bit, is does the model of having a clear shareholding and dividend help achieve responsible governance in the interest of shareholders? Maybe Paul, if you can comment first. Yeah.
I actually think it does. I think that the clear shareholding and the dividend process has helped achieve that. I think that the councils are intent on making sure that the business is as managed as well as possible, and the fact that it does comply with good governance principles and those sort of things. And so I think that it has actually done that. And I think that the fact that the councils have demonstrated that they have worked very closely with Taswater to ensure that it is meeting the objectives that the councils wanted to achieve for their communities as well. So I think there's been some really good outcomes as a result of that.
And in Victoria, are we missing out, Michael, Russell?
No, I'll comment first, Russell, if you like. But no, we're not. We've got a clear shareholder. The Minister for Water is the shareholder. The shareholder has set expectations to the water corporations that are clearly laid out. The dividend policy, which is quite old, but is there on the public website for everyone to see how the dividend is calculated based on net profit after tax payments. It's a clear model. It's just that there is effectively there's a single shareholder. There's a single share, and so your interaction is very much that it's a one-on-one with that board. But look, from the other side of it, the governance is taken care of. But as Russell explained earlier on, we have a couple of pieces of legislation that are quite old and quite convoluted. Over time, that's developed into the similar model that Tasmania has with their shareholder letter of expectation. We have a statement of obligations in Victoria, and that really cuts through all the act and tells you what you have to do. And that's a 22-page contract between the board and the minister. The minister signs it off each year, and the board has to report on it twice a year, and they have to report immediately if there's any movement away from that. That covers the price submission, community and customer engagement, risk management, planning, all your water services, including recycled water, trade waste, all the key components of the water corporation, and ultimately compliance. So I think the model's there. It is different to the Tasmanian model because of the single shareholder. Right?
Thank you. While we're on this subject, I suppose there was a question from Talit that's related to this. So Talit's asking, who makes the final decision on capital investment? Is it the board, parliament, minister, utility companies themselves, etc.? So maybe we can talk about the pricing submission plan too here.
So maybe if I could kick that one off, Mark, is that as part of the business plan for an organisation, there'd be some fairly well spelt out overview of where the capital money is going to be spent. It might be building some new facilities for a new growth area where developers, of course, will be also contributing. But in terms of who makes the decision, it's really made at the board, by the board. It would be presented to the board from the management in terms of this is what we think we need to do, either for the overall 12-month period or 2-year period looking out, or the specifics. Here is a project ready to now be approved. So the proposal would come to the board from management in terms of let's go forward with this. The board would determine to go along that way or to query it as required. But I'd just like to also add a little bit more to the earlier question that you asked about Victoria and Tasmania in terms of the shareholding and the dividend policy. My recollection was at the time of formation of South East Water, the 3 retail businesses, it was very, very clearly enunciated that about 2/3 of the after-tax profit would be paid back to government as a dividend. I think that stood in place for quite some time. But these days we're in very different times across the world, including New Zealand, obviously, with COVID. And the state government has dug very deep, state government Victoria, to pay all sorts of support payments to different groups, etc. And their indebtedness has gone up enormously. So it's to be expected that they will be looking towards government business enterprises who pay dividends to perhaps individually dig a bit deeper, to the extent of maybe the gearing needs to go up. So maybe we might have a situation where water authorities might need to borrow some money, increase their gearing to help make a bigger contribution dividend-wise to the state government. So we're in a changing time, but it's understandable. This is why that might be necessary.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Before we go off this topic, perhaps we have touched on it, but can we just explain the pricing submission process? Because it is an important part of governance.
Michael, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Russell. So we have an economic regulator, the Essential Services Commission, and it's taken about 20 years for that to evolve to quite a mature model. It's a very mature model now. So the pricing regulator, how that works is that you can set your price for anything up to 5 years. 3 years is quite often the case. You undertake quite a long process to do that pricing submission. You undertake a significant amount of community consultation and customer consultation. And why I use those two words is you're not just responsible to the customers that pay you in Victoria, you're responsible to the community you serve. And sometimes that community doesn't have a water or sewage service, but you have a catchment in their area, or somehow you're impacting on them. So there's a lot of consultation that happens to build up the plan. And then there's a lot of community forums, a lot of sessions with business leaders and all sorts of people to ensure that your plan is robust and is very transparent to everybody about what you're going to achieve. You then submit that to the Essential Services Commission. They then review that both from a customer point of view, but also from an economic point of view to ensure the viability. They have two main reasons for existence. One is they are there to protect the customer, ensure the customer is getting the service at the right price, and that performance is being maintained of the utility. The second thing is that they also ensure the financial viability. So they ensure there's enough money from a cash flow point of view to maintain the business at the agreed levels that they have agreed with you. So once you submit that, they then undertake their own consultation with the community, and they hold public forums before they'll make a determination for you for your price coming forward for the next 5 years. Now, when they do that determination, there's all sorts of things embedded in it. There's a productivity improvement equation put in there, but there's also a return on assets, a return of assets. There's an operating cost model in there, and it's all about being efficient. Any flaws in that really is the fact that sometimes it doesn't take account of the longer term enough, because these are long life assets, 55-year plus assets. But at the end of the day, it comes up with a model that usually gives you an outcome that the corporation can then work with going forward and have a degree of certainty as to the cash flows.
Thanks, Mike. We've got quite a few questions, so simple. So before I move on, I believe the pricing submission process is the same or very similar in Tasmania, Paul.
Yeah, it is. It's very similar to what Michael's just explained.
And I think it's fairly standard across most of the country these days. What level do you guys know what level of remuneration directors receive?
I can tell you that in Tasmania, the board in total, that's the chair plus the 6 directors, in the annual report, their remuneration was about 500,000. My understanding is a director is around that 45 to 50,000, and obviously the chair gets a significant amount more than that.
In the case of Victoria, the remuneration is a function of how big the organisation is. So there's a couple of categories of water organisations. At the smaller level, the remuneration might be of the order of $15,000 to $20,000 per year. At the bigger end of the organisation, it might be around $50,000 or $60,000 per year. In each case, the chairman would probably get another 50% on top of that. A lot of people take on these roles across Victoria in both big and small organisations, not for the money, but because they want to give something back and to make use of their collective experience and wisdom or what have you. I've been involved in quite a number of boards on both sides of the table. I very rarely hear comments about the external directors should be paid more or paid too much. It's just not really a discussion topic.
Right, thank you. A question from Priyana. Have the benefits of this model been realised? So we'll maybe go to Tasmania first with it. So have the benefits of the model been realised in Tasmania? And would you have changed the approach knowing what we know now, or what you know now?
I think that the benefits of the model certainly has been realised. I think there has been a significant improvement in the way that the delivery of the water and sewage services in the Tasmanian community has improved as a result of TasWater. Would you change the approach? We had a process where we went through regional authorities to start off with, and the governor's arrangements were put in place for that. It was cumbersome. It was not necessarily the best way. And I think that the model we now have is actually really kicking some goals, and we're actually moving forward in a really good direction.
Okay, great, thanks. And Victoria, any comments on that? No, I think we're happy with the approach we've taken and the outcomes there. If I can add to that, I suppose we're talking about not just a professional board, and it is important to have a professional board that knows obviously what they're doing, but because, say, in the Tasmanian case, building TasWater as a corporation, you've been able to build up a fairly strong professional workforce. So the two go hand in hand. It's not just the board, it's the organization, the capability that exists within it. And the scale there has allowed them to do that, as it has in Victoria.
Look, I think picking up on that point, Mark, the skill level that we now have and the people we now have delivering our water and sewage services in Tasmania is far superior to what we had previously when it was 29 separate councils delivering the water and sewage in a fairly ad hoc way and at very varying levels. So I think that it has been a major improvement.
Okay, great. And we'll be hearing from two executives at TasWater the week after next too. So that's good. Question from Talit. Are all board directors independent? And what is the selection process? I think Tasmania's got an easier answer to that. Victoria might be a little bit trickier. So I'll go to Tassie first.
All right. Yes, ours are all independent. They, as I explained earlier on, they are appointed by, there's an owners representative group that actually selects the board. And there are some criteria that is developed around the skills matrix that's required. And so if you actually look at the TasWater board makeup, it's got a couple of engineers, it's got some accountants, it's got community representatives. They're all independent. A number of them are actually from the mainland. They're not necessarily Tasmanian. They are the best people that are available at that stage for a role on TasWater. So certainly,
I believe 3 of your board directors are not Tasmanians. They're
currently 3 of them are non-Tasmanian. When I think there has been a time when there was only 1 that was a non-Tasmanian, but currently there's 3 non-Tasmanians on the board.
Right, thanks.
I think just to perhaps comment on that, I think it's a very good thing to have people from afar on a board, because that actually helps to reinforce the level of independence. The closer you are to the organisation, the greater the chance there could be something which could cause them to lose that independence. Maybe if I could give an example of that, is that early in the time of South East Water, we, like every other water authority in the world, had what was called a legacy IT system. I think as soon as an IT system gets to be more than 12 months old, it's a legacy IT system. I'm trying to be a bit smart. Anyway, there was a need to change the IT system to create a new billing system. So we needed new hardware, we needed new software. One of our directors was on an advisory group or advisory panel for an IT billing company supplier. Wasn't really on the board, but he was certainly involved with that company in a way. As soon as it was known that company was going to be a bidder for our replacement legacy system, that director did exactly the right thing and said, I can't be party to any of this. I will stand down from any discussions on the board about the choice of supplier. And furthermore, when you send the board papers out, please make sure you don't send me anything to do with this particular topic. That's exactly the right way to handle it. That sort of thing could happen with regards to where a person lives, but I think one has to be prepared for that under the general sort of conflicts of interest type issue, to make sure that in terms of corporate governance, due process is being followed.
Thank you. Question from Hugh Blake Manson. What performance standards do you have in place? Environmental, infrastructure, other, etc. How effective have these standards been in delivering quality, efficiency, and outcomes?
Well, perhaps if I could just kick that one off. When the three retail water businesses were created back in 1995, there was a very strong move towards benchmarking, and it was called competition by comparison. So we had a whole raft of KPIs, things like sewer spills, interruptions, time of interruptions, quality of water, all sorts of parameters there. And the idea was that in the early days, the three retail businesses would be compared year to year in terms of how they were performing. So it was comparing them to one business to the other two, but also more importantly, it was comparing each business to their own record on those KPIs from the year before. The plan was for all of that to sort of move through the rest of the state, Victoria, to continue that sort of benchmarking approach, which has happened, maybe called by different names. But I think when you have that as a driver, it's a very good thing within the business to be able to encourage, how can we continually strive for better performance? The fact we're operating okay, making a reasonable profit, that's good, but how can we do it better, and how can we strive to do it better? That's the real drive, which is, I think, so important.
Thank you.
Mark,
Yep.
also, the economic regulator publishes a report card against all those measures. So when you do your pricing plan, you're asking for funding for everything from your customer service right through to your infrastructure performance. And there's dozens and dozens of them, and they sum them up, and they put out annually they put out a report card. It's very transparent. It's open to the public, and it tells you that one is how you compare yourself against every other water corporation in the state. And secondly, it tells you how you're comparing against the money that you requested that you get funded for. And if you don't meet those standards, your next pricing plan, that there is certainly a negative put in there for that.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just say, well, I never met the targets, and on you go on your merry way. You're expected to meet those performance over a long period of time.
Okay, so they are being held accountable by the regulator on what they say they're going to do.
That's correct.
From a Tasmanian point of view, when councils managed water and sewage, we had 33 of our potable water supply services on boil water notices. We now have 0. Every one of the potable water supplies now meet the current drinking water standards. I think it was over 40 or 50 wastewater plants did not meet current standards in 2008-9 when we first lost the water and sewage services to the new system. So the Taswater are working through that. A lot of those systems have now been upgraded and are now complying. The example I've made before about Flinders Island only having a very small percentage of the ownership of Taswater, Taswater invested several millions of dollars bringing the water and sewage services on Flinders Island up to a appropriate standard. So there's some of the benefits of making sure that you are meeting the requirements and the guidelines that are in place.
So everybody in Tasmania, as in Victoria, but certainly Tasmanian example, whether you live in Hobart or Flinders Island, you've got access to the same quality of drinking water and also, I suppose, environmental discharge of wastewater, etc. There is work still going on in Tasmania. They haven't quite sorted out all their environmental issues, but some of those projects are quite large.
Yes.
So they're still working their way through that. So another question is, we've touched on it with the pricing submission. So I might ask this question to you, Michael, is do communities get input into local infrastructure investment? So while we've talked about what happens in the PSP, maybe we can talk about what happens prior to that in terms of interaction between council, communities and the water corps.
Sure. So there's every organisation that I'm aware of in Victoria in the water space particularly have strong community consultation mechanisms. Now, our requirement is to have a customer consultative committee and an environmental consultative committee. Now, all projects that affect local communities would go initially through those, so the board can get a feeling from the customer and the environmental consultative committees as to where they feel those projects sit and how important they are to their local communities. So there's also then a lot of engagement happens. We don't just go in there with the bulldozers. The engagement happens from day one and usually takes just as long as the actual project itself. So there's a lot of community consultation, a lot of public forum meetings, a lot of open meetings, a lot of advertisements in local newspapers to those people telling them that we've got a major infrastructure project to be undertaken in their area. So we seek all that feedback, and that's always presented to the board before, as part of the business case, before it moves any forward. So there's methods of customer and community consultation, and they're undertaken to ensure that the community comes along with the project, and that usually is the case. But if the community has a strong feeling against a project, that's also taken into account. I've been involved in projects where we have stopped and looked at alternatives, e.g. where we wanted to sewer an area, but people didn't really want that, so they wanted a more environmental solution. And down the coast, that has happened a couple of times. So there's a whole range of ways that can happen. And because the authorities are so transparent, we put out our capital works programs annually, but it actually gives you a 5 to 10 year look at it. So there's a lot of information out there, and people get a pretty good understanding about what's going to happen in their local community before anything touches the ground.
Great, thanks, Michael. I'll go to you first with this one, Paul. I think you've touched on it already, but how long do directors sit on the Taswater board? 3-year terms? Is that?
3-year terms.
3-year terms, and they can do 2 terms.
2 terms is my understanding.
Yep, that's our understanding. I think that's a fairly standard model in Victoria too, Russell.
I'd say so, yeah.
Michael?
4 years,
4 years, is it?
4 years and 2 terms.
Yep.
And directors are quite often, though, when they finish their 2 terms, if they've got exceptionally high value on a board, they quite often move to another corporation either after 4 years or 8 years. Someone could be on South East Water Board where Russell was, and suddenly be on Barwon Water Board where I was.
So
Mark,
they can't stay on after 2 terms, though. They have
No.
to move.
Yeah.
Mark, just to clarify from a Tasmania point of view, I happen to have the shareholders' letter of expectation sitting here in front of me. 3-year terms, a maximum period of 10 years is that they can, from the date of their first appointment, but that 10-year period may be extended only by special majority of the selection committee. So it has to be a resolution selection committee and a special majority.
To that point, the selection committee are all elected.
The selection committee are made up of the members, the 4 members and the chair. So as I spoke before, 1 from each of the north and the south, and 2 from the, 1 from the north and the northwest, and 2 from the south, and 1 representative of the state government. It's the selection committee.
But the local government ones, are they elected, or could they just be anyone that they appoint?
The owner representatives are elected officials. So they have to be elected officials. They have to be a member of the owner representative group. And the owner representative group can only be elected.
Yep. Okay. But the state government rep doesn't have to be elected.
It's usually a department person.
Yep. Okay, great. Okay. A question from Margaret Devlin. What changes, if any, would we make to the current models? I mean, say you have to start from scratch. Russell, Michael, you might want to try that
maybe I could start off there, and Michael could follow on. The way I see it is that the current model we have is continuing to change. It hasn't really reached an end point. And I could illustrate that by saying that back in '95, when the 3 retails were created, one of those 3 was City West Water, which obviously on the western part of metropolitan Melbourne. It was the smaller of the 3. It's boundary joined with Western Water, which goes a little bit further out towards Ballarat, covers those growth areas. I was on the board of Western Water, and there were a lot of discussions about new developments that were happening just on that border. Someone's got to draw a line in the sand somewhere and say this is the border. But then developers come along and buy a bit of land that goes across the borderline. So there were some real issues about, well, who's going to put the infrastructure in? Is it City West Water or is it Western Water? And there were pros and cons for each. And obviously both organisations were working together closely because obviously we're all owned by the same shareholder. We've got to give a consistent message to what's happening there. But the end result was, well, why don't we just combine Western Water with City West Water, give it a new name? And that happened, I think, not that many months ago, earlier this year sometime. It was a logical thing to do. The boards were combined. There were some people who obviously didn't stay on the boards, but that was being driven effectively for what's good for the customer base, and how can it be more efficient. So it was the right decision to take. It had been talked about for a little bit of time, but it happened. In terms of other changes,
Sorry, can I just stop
Sorry.
you for a second? Margaret, can you confirm, are you talking about governance models, ownership models, or general industry model in the States? Can you just confirm that in the chat, please? Keep going.
Yeah.
Sorry, Russell.
Yeah, so I mean, nothing's changing in terms of public sector ownership. That's been clearly locked down for more than 20 years, and I don't see that changing in the foreseeable future. So that side is pretty well locked away. There's been ongoing developments to improve the level of wastewater treatment plant operation. And it's really a question of where the treated effluent goes. I touched on that earlier about the EPA would rather the treated effluent be disposed to land for land use, for growing turf or things like that. But that can't be done in every place. So there's ongoing sort of focus on that. There are many places across Victoria which over the years, the communities moved from having septic tanks to having sewage reticulation systems. And that's being driven largely by the fact that this will help to improve the water quality, the drinking water quality, because there's of the separation between what goes into aquifers in some places and what's drawn out of aquifers in other places for drinking water. So those sort of things continue to change. But in terms of the model, I don't see much more to add to that, but maybe Michael could add to that.
Margaret has confirmed she was talking of all of the above. So maybe if you can comment, Michael, if you had a clean slate, would you change the governance model?
No, not necessarily there. I think the model with if you're going to be owned by the state government, the model that we have works well. I'll leave it at that. There's no need to tamper with it. It's clear what the involvement of the Minister of Water is, what the Treasurer is, and all the key regulating departments. I think the only thing I would say that Russell made mention of earlier that I think is really important is I would pull those amendments to the Water Act to simplify it off the shelf and make that happen, to get a clean slate from day one if we were going to recreate these. That's the complication.
If I can ask,
in fact, maybe Mark, if I could just add a little bit more to that point. One of the things in the current Water Legislation Act allows Melbourne Water to go into people's backyards in the case of sewage emergencies. They've given the right to go in there and to start to do things in someone's backyard because blockages or whatever. That particular factor was used to allow the digging of a major pipeline in rural land in Yea as part of the North-South pipeline. And a rural farm had something like a 200-metre easement put through the middle of their farm so that the contractor could actually dig a massive, great trench to put a pipeline in. They were really reliant on that Melbourne Water into the backyard amendment to work on a multi-hundred-acre farm. Caused a huge amount of angst, and when the lawyers started to have a poke at it, it was on for young and old, because they were really using the wrong sort of piece of legislation to control an activity that was envisaged in all under the water industry, but just different variations. So just leave that one there.
Thank you. Just if I can just maybe ask you a loaded question on this one, Michael, and it has to do with board selection, I suppose.
Yep.
Because we have spoken about this before. While the state government owns the utility, is there scope in a model, not this model, but in a model where the actual board selection process happens can involve local government or other stakeholders? and have a say in it. So having something similar to Tasmania without necessarily the ownership there.
Yeah, if you had a clean slate, I think that would be a wonderful way of doing it, because the linkages between local government and water corporations have actually probably never been closer since all this reform started. I know a number of water corporations are doing joint projects with local government and local council. So if I had a clean slate, I would certainly promote that whole scenario, because water is such an integral part of council and what the services they're providing to their communities. So I think that would be a wonderful thing to be able to have some sort of representation if you had a clean slate to do that. As I said, there's a number of projects I know directly that in the Geelong area I live in, that the council are actively participating with the water corporation. They're very closely linked. The water corporation.
I'd certainly endorse that. I think that's a very good idea.
Yeah.
I'd endorse that.
The water corporation in the Geelong area actually has as its mantra regional prosperity. It actually doesn't put up there, we're here to supply water and sewer services. It said we're here through the provision of those services for regional prosperity. And that's what local government strives for. So there's a clear linkage.
Yes.
So one last quick question for you, Paul, from Leslie. Are the dividends really necessary for the local government entities in New Zealand, in Tasmania, sorry?
That question would be answered differently depending on which council you talk to. Depending on their financial situation, some councils rely heavily on the dividends. Others, it's just basically a little bit of cream that comes in that they can spread across the top of the cake. So it varies from council to council. Smaller councils, the dividends are important to them, and that was seen as probably a way of encouraging councils to actually get on board with water reforms in the first place.
Right, thanks. And the dividends paid to the state government in Victoria?
In the case of the regionals, not the three metropolitan ones, yeah, Treasury see it, to be honest, Treasury see it as a little bit of cream. And in most years, when I declared a dividend at the corporation I was CFO for, the government actually sent a letter advising they weren't taking that and leave it as retained earnings and reinvest it. Now, in the Melbourne case, they rely on it very heavily, so there's not that degree of liberalism towards the dividend. Russell, is there?
Well, no, I think it's a question of scale as well, and indeed the way the retail businesses in Melbourne were set up. They were set up with an ability to manage a fairly modest debt portfolio, still significant but fairly modest, and the combined dividends that the four businesses provide to government each year runs to something like $400 or $500 million. So it's a significant chunk of money, and it will increase substantially to cover the COVID costs in the times ahead.
Thanks very much. We are out of time. Just 10 seconds each. Just to conclude, Michael, please go first.
Just wish everyone all the best in the journey that you're looking at the moment, and thank you for your time today.
Great, thanks, Russell.
Look, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I know it's a very important journey you're on in terms of making the right decision. I think going through the process with Spiker to look at what's happening elsewhere, and particularly what's working well elsewhere and what's working not so well elsewhere, is a very vital part of pulling it all together and making the optimum decision at the end of the day. And for that, I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thanks, Russell. Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Same thing. Good luck to everybody. These reforms aren't easy. Having been on the council side of things when they've happened here in Tasmania, I had my doubts about how it would turn out, and certainly I'm a convert. I worked through the system, and I was initially resisting. Now I think, why would we go back?
Great.
So good luck,
Paul. Thanks everyone in New Zealand. Thank you for your time this morning, and thank you. Bye-bye.